Thank you so much, and thank you, BIC, for this opportunity and for that introduction. And thank you so much for coming in. It's really lovely to see all of you. This talk will be for about 30 minutes, and then happy to sit with Praneet and discuss things. So, what I'm going to do is, let me start off by telling you that, when I normally tell people, or when people get to know that I'm involved in otter conservation, generally there are two questions that people ask. Almost always. The first is, how did you get involved in otter conservation? Right? And people who know me really well, they are not so polite. They would say, how did you get involved in otter conservation? But I won't get there now. The second question generally that people ask, which is more a rhetorical question, is, there are otters in India? And let me start by answering the second question first. Yes, there are otters in India. There are 3 species of them, and we'll talk about these otters as we go into this presentation a little bit. But for the moment, what I want to do is to show you a lovely little kind of infographic of World Otter Day, incidentally, is the last Wednesday of May every year. And there are 13 species of otters that are found worldwide. And as you can see, they're pretty much everywhere. The largest otter that you find in the world is the giant otter, which is found in the Amazonian ecosystem. And the smallest otter is one that you find very much in India. It's called the Asian small-clawed otter, and that's the otter that we are working on, and I'll come back to that later on in the course of the presentation. The only two continents where you don't see otters are Australia and Antarctica. So there's quite a lot of diversity within the otter family, so to speak. And just as Australia, where you don't see otters, is an evolutionary oddity of sorts, otters themselves, if you really think about it, they are evolutionary oddities. And I'll tell you why, just for a moment. For starters, they are freshwater mammals, and if you really think about how many freshwater mammals you know, there aren't too many of them. I mean, for those of you who are involved in wildlife or familiar with wildlife, you might think of the dolphin, the freshwater dolphin that you see, for example, in the Ganges ecosystem, the Brahmaputra or the Indus and so on. But you can't think of too many of them, right? And otters have evolved brilliantly as freshwater mammals. The second one is that what you find in otters is, very interestingly, they are quite adaptable and resilient, which is also unusual for a freshwater species. So if you look at fish, for example, or so many other biota that you find in rivers and streams and ponds and lakes, these are very sensitive to temperature, water quality, water quantity, the substrate, the soil, for example. But these species of otters are by and large pretty adaptable, pretty resilient. And I'll take examples of this as we go forward. And the last is, given their size, by and large, if you leave out the giant otters, the others are not really very large. And given their size, they have evolved in a way to become a predator right at the top of the food chain or the food pyramid, or call it what you will. And how they have managed to do that is a fascinating story by itself in the whole thing of evolution. We will come back to that possibly in the course of a little bit and look at how that actually works to protect them in some sense. But let's talk about the 3 species that you find in India. The two at the top are the ones that I and a couple of my colleagues who are in the audience have worked on in the past few years. So the one on the left on top is the smooth-coated otter. How many of you have seen otters in the wild? Can you put your hands up? That's a pretty fair population, right? And I can see that what you are likely to have seen, say if you went to the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, the Kaveri River, for example, what you're likely to have seen is the smooth-coated otter. Right? The other species, the smaller one that you see on the right, is the Asian small-clawed otter, which is generally found in the headwater regions of rivers. That's up in the hills, for example, in the Western Ghats, the Eastern Ghats. You find them in parts of the Northeast, most of the Northeast actually, and in a section of the Himalayan ecosystem, about which we know very little. But I'll come back to the Asian small-clawed otter in some time. Let's look at the smooth-coated otter for a moment. That's India's largest otter that you find. They live in packs. Those packs are called romps, by the way. Just for you to know that people who work on otters, we have our own language, right? English is an incidental part of it. So the otter den is called a holt, H-O-L-T, and the group of otters or the pack of otters is called a romp. So they live in romps. They are active during the day, which is why people can photograph them, put it up on social media and that sort of thing. And they also hunt a lot during the night. And as many of you who've seen otters know, that they can be quite aggressive in protecting their turf, particularly if this is the season, incidentally, when the pups are born around August, September, and around this time, they actually are just learning to swim. So if somebody gets into the water for a swim, a human being, and without realizing it is not very far from the den, there's likely to be an encounter. And because they have very sharp teeth, it can't end very well for the human being, right? Just to let you know. And there are cases in Kerala where otters have actually bitten people and so on and so forth. That's generally, we're talking about the smooth-coated otter. And it's a very charming animal. And like all otters, there's a fair amount of bonding, which I'll come to in just about a minute. And watching them is a pleasure. You can sit there all day just watching them play, interact, because they're very social animals. The small-clawed otter, the Asian small-clawed otter, which is the world's smallest otter, is quite different in its behavior. It tends to be reclusive. It's very shy of people. It's nocturnal and crepuscular, which means it's active primarily in dawn and dusk. Very, very difficult to spot it. In fact, in all these years of my searching for it, I have seen it only once, and that too for a fraction of a second as it entered the water. My colleague Yashas, who's there in the audience, he has worked on it for 2 seasons, and he's still not seen it, right? And we do complain a fair bit, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's the way they are, right? So they are really reclusive. And so the question that some of you might ask, which I'll answer later, is if we don't see it, if we have no chance of spotting it, how do we study it? And I'll come back to that just a little bit later when I talk about our project in the beautiful landscape of Coog. The one at the bottom is the Eurasian otter. And this is an otter which was initially thought to be in the Himalayas, in the higher regions of the Himalayas, very comfortable in snow, etc. This is what we thought we knew about it. But a lot of evidence has turned up in the last decade and a half, which shows that they may be far more widespread than that. So some excellent work done by researchers at Center for Wildlife Studies, for example, has shown that they are present in the central India landscape. And there have been a couple of carcasses of this species that have been recovered in the peninsular Indian landscape, in South India, for example. So we still are learning about just where they are. And they also tend to be nocturnal, so it's a lot more difficult to spot. And therefore, the easiest one to spot is the smooth-coated otter, which is up there on the left, right? Here's an interesting bit. I've talked a bit about social bonding, and otters exhibit marvelous behavior as far as cohesion is concerned. So this photo was taken by a conservationist called Danish Shastri, and it's from the Ramganga River in Corbett. And what he noticed was, as all of you can see, that lady is injured, right? And what he noticed was that the rest of the otter romp was actually catching fish and bringing it to her to eat. Now, when you have behavior like that in a species, that kind of cooperation and that kind of collaborative behavior, the chances are that the species is likely to be more resilient. Right? That they're likely to recover from a setback much more than, let's say, many other species. Now, they also are very territorial, and they do tend to fight across packs or romps, but they come together on occasions that we don't really understand to collaborate at certain times of the year. For example, we have seen in the month of December and early Jan, we have seen 2 packs of otters coming together to form a large group in the Kaveri River of 21 of them. And that was delightful, absolutely delightful to watch. But we don't know why they came together, because about a month or 2 later, they separate again. So there's a lot that we need to really learn about them. But now that we know that they're resilient, why are they so much in trouble? And I want to take a detour from the main presentation to tell you a little bit of a story and my journey with otters. So I got interested in wildlife in the 90s, and I saw my first otter in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary in 2001. And obviously, it was love at first sight. You know, those of you who have seen otters, I don't need to tell you more. It's an animal that you cannot not love if you see, right? It's impossible to say, I don't like this animal. They're so charming. They're absolutely incredible. So obviously, it was love at first sight. And I continued to be a wildlife volunteer, work with a couple, you know, in my spare time with an NGO and so on. Around 2009, I read a piece in a magazine called Tehelka, which doesn't exist anymore, in which the piece, there was a central piece that was covering wildlife crime and poaching of animals. And in that, they talked about how a few tiger skins had been recovered from a poaching gang, a lot more leopard skins, and over 600 otter skins. Over 600 of them. And otter skins are, well, they call pelts. And it was the first time I had actually come across information that people kill otters. Why would you want to do that? And then it talked about the grisly manner in which these otters were killed. They were generally caught in a jaw trap, and they were clubbed to death with a hammer. And the reason they were killed that way was to preserve the pelt or the skin, which was then, as we researched and talked to people, and I have friends in the wildlife community who did a fair bit of work in stopping this sort of crime. So I kind of learned a fair bit by listening to them and meeting them. And what we understood was that this pelt was being sent out of India. It was being exported along with tiger skins and so on into the international wildlife trade market. And those years, from the mid-90s thereabouts to around 2010, 2011, were terrible years for wildlife in India. There was so much of crime that was happening and poaching, and otters suffered possibly more than many other species. There were organized gangs that used to go from river to river, just fishing the otters out, right? And fishermen who don't like otters very much because they sort of, in some way, damage the nets and they damage the fish that are caught in the nets, they were often helping these people catch the otter and take it out of the river. So we then learned that WWF actually reported that the people who are in the fur trade and who make these jackets and so-called, the furriers as they're called, they considered otter fur to be the diamond of their business because they were dense and durable and that sort of thing. And just as we started doing work along the Kaveri River to look at what's going on, I'm sorry, let me just go back, to look at what's going on and how we could combat this, otter poaching actually declined. So that kind of coincided with the time when we got involved in conservation. And I have lots of good news to share, which is because they're resilient, they have made some sort of a comeback. Now, why did it decline? It declined because there was a fair bit of, there were a number of arrests made, the kingpins were caught, that sort of thing. So it was more a law and order thing that got resolved, thankfully. And the organized crime, which was visible all across the country, it came down significantly around 2011, 2012, that time frame. That was also the time that we were getting sort of to understand what was going wrong and how we could stop it. Over the last 10 years, from 2012 to 22, when we worked in the Kaveri River, and we worked alongside a number of fishermen, for example, we could see otters making a comeback and making quite a very good, healthy comeback. And therefore, I just want to tell you, and this might come up in the Q&A at some point, I am an optimist. I am a sort of possibly an incurable optimist, because I go back to the early 1990s. Many people in this audience weren't born at that time. And I just want to tell you, at that time I had just started volunteering in wildlife. And Bittu Saigal, who runs the Sanctuary magazine and is quite a legend, he had written an article in the mid-90s saying that at the rate at which poaching is happening, by the year 2000, we won't have tigers left in India, right? And it certainly was very upsetting to read that. It was very depressing at some point. But we know that, thankfully, that didn't happen. We know that today tigers and the habitat of tigers and tigers have made some sort of a comeback. I think it's important for us to look at the glass being half full, because that's the key to conservation. And I'll come back to that a little bit more as I go forward. Having said that, we know worldwide 12 out of 13 species are declining. The Eurasian otter is the only one that's not actually declining. And a big part of that decline is because of the habitat. Otters are crucially dependent on habitat. So if the water quality deteriorates beyond a point, if the forests along the streams that we call riparian buffers, which I'll come to in a slide or two, if they are damaged beyond a point, you have a problem. And of course, the conflict with fishermen, right, which I've already spoken about. So the arrow that points, this is an otter which has, I don't know if you can see that as clearly as possible, as I would like you to, which is around its back, it's actually got a snare that's got stuck. So it was caught in a snare, it managed to escape, but that snare was, and this photo is about 3 years old, so I hope the otter is still alive. I don't know anything about it after that. But the fact of the matter is that there is an ever-present threat with in the conflict with fishermen. And I don't blame the fishermen because their livelihoods are at stake. And we've tried very hard to see if we could work out some kind of a live and let live sort of philosophy, which wasn't possible on the ground. Conservation is hard work. It's really hard work because you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with very disparate views, and I, as a city person, come there and tell them something that they're not prepared to hear, right? I don't speak their language. So we speak chalk and cheese in some sense. And we can talk more about that when Praneet and I talk about human-wildlife conflict, and he's actually far more qualified to talk about it than I am, having seen it at a very diverse level. So let me talk about why otters are the guardians of the river. Why do we really consider them to be so? It really starts with habitat, right? A riparian buffer is something that I want to briefly introduce. It's a kind of strip of forest which you see on both sides of the river. And this strip is super important for the stream or the river. It's important because what actually happens is, other than the kind of ecological services it gives us, like it prevents erosion, as an example, right, during heavy monsoons, right, it also provides the shade and the nutrients to an immense diversity of biota on which, for example, species like crabs depend. And the small clawed otter, which is what we are working on now, 80% of its diet is crab. Right? So if you were to work down the trophic cascade, if you were to go down from the apex predator to the bottom, you would actually look at the habitat as being the crucial thing to conserve. And therefore, our work in Coog is to work with coffee planters, to look at, to work in partnership with them to conserve stream habitat and the regions around the stream, so that it's not just otters, but a lot more species that actually thrive. And again, that's when I talk about our project in Coog. I'll come to that in about a minute from now. But there's something connected to this. If you look at a river or a stream, when we conserve otters, we also protect a lot more. We protect, for example, bar-headed geese. We protect pelicans. We protect marsh harriers, that's there on the extreme, the raptor on the right of the screen. River terns, that little, that camera trap image in the center, that's the brown fish owl, for example. Crab species, and what you see in the bottom camera trap image is a fishing cat, which typically shares habitat with otters. So you're not just protecting one species, it also provides a kind of umbrella for a whole host of species that we want to protect. Right? And therefore, it provides that level of ecosystem service to us, and it does something very different. I'm going to move completely away from otters to tell you something that we may not have really even thought about. How many of you drink coffee here? Put your hands up. Hopefully you love it. This is one person from Coog I know, so she loves her coffee, right? Once again, let's do a show of hands, yeah? Oh, that's a big, yeah. So I just want you to know that every time you have your coffee, take a cap off, a hat off, to the bee, because there's a bee in your coffee, right? Now, what's the connection? If you were to look at that infographic, and the person who designed it, I was hoping she would come. She's not here right now. But this, the basic research was done by quite an amazing person called Dr. Smita Krishnan. And what she said was that, what she figured was there are 26 species of insects and birds that actually pollinate your coffee. Now, out of that, one species, which is the wild rock bee, which in Kannada is called Hejjenu, or in the scientific name is Apis dorsata, that's responsible for about 60% of your pollination. And that hives, or it has its hive on 3 species of trees largely. The mango, which is the marvel, the sampige, which is a Magnolia champaka, and Viteria indica, which is the dhupamara, as we know in Kannada, for example. And if those species thrive, if you don't prune them, your coffee set goes up. But if you chop them, your coffee production comes down by 1/3. Right? Now here's the connection between bee, coffee, and otters. All these 3 species are found along streams. So if we protect our streams and we protect the riparian buffer there, it's not just for the otters, it's for our coffee as well. So there are multiple linkages that we look at when you look at a single species and the protection of that. My friend Hanumant and I, we were in a coracle in the Kaveri River when we saw this beautiful, this is a pack of otters not very far from us, and they were hunting. And I have Sandeep, where are you? Yeah, there's Sandeep. So Sandeep is part of a wonderful organization called the Wildlife Association of South India, and they work on fish. In particular, they work on the mashir and other species of fish in the river and how we could conserve them. Now, his team and I, we've often talked about that one invasive species called the African catfish, which is in the mouth of the otter there. Now, this African catfish is an omnivore. It eats everything, right? And there are hundreds and thousands of it in the Kaveri River, not like otters. So the damage that otters do is a fraction of the damage that species does. And as the name indicates, it's not native to India. It was brought in to be grown in cages, etc. It escaped and went into the rivers, and it's become a nuisance across parts of the country. So by feeding, though this is not the main prey of otters, but they also feed on African catfish, it's opportunistic. So we've talked to fishermen to tell them that, look, this is a way in which the otter actually protects you, because it protects the overall amount of fish in the river. There's an old English saying, there's more fish in the river. Actually, there isn't. It's actually declining in some sense. And it's declining because of so many threats that the rivers face, and I don't need to go into that in any big detail. I want to tell you a little bit about, how much time do I have, Advaita? Do I have 5-10 minutes? I do? Thank you so much. Right. So a little bit about the Koile Mean project. And what is Koile Mean? So we work in Coorg, and we have a little project there where we work in the Brahmagiris area of Coorg, which is a magically beautiful hill chain that separates Kerala from Kodagu. And what we do is to work with the planters there to protect the habitat. And what does this mean for us? It basically means, so let me talk about the Koile Mean. That little fish that you see down there, that's a tiny little loach which is available in the paddy fields in Coorg, for example. It swims down from the hills during the second half of the monsoon or the latter period, which is actually now. So this is the time when the people in Coorg actually would harvest it, and it's considered a delicacy. I am, just as an aside and with no reference to otters, I myself happen to be a vegetarian. But I know for a fact that people in Coorg just completely love the curries and the fries made with the Koile Mean, right? And it is part of the cultural tradition. It is part of their ethos, this fish, the Koile Mean. And here's the catch. That's a pun. I never realized it. Here's the catch. Okay, so the point is that in the last 2 decades, the catch of this fish, the harvest of this fish, has dropped by over 90%. How do I know that? By talking to the intermediaries in the trade. We know that what's happening to this fish is it's on the verge, it's teetering between survival and extinction. It's somewhere there. And it's completely got to do with the quality of water, because like I mentioned much earlier, crabs and fish like the Koile Mean are very sensitive. They're very sensitive to temperature changes in the quality. So things like people using poisons on the plantation, weedicide, pesticide as 2 examples, right? People using poisons like copper sulfate to catch fish, which happens across the Western Ghats, right, are huge threats to species like this. We started working on the Koile Mean as it's a loach. It belongs to the loach family. It's called the spiny loach. We started working on it because it's also the prey of the small clawed otter. And people in Coorg have a kind of sentimental attachment to this fish. And therefore, we realized that if we work on conserving this fish, we can co-opt the local folks into the conservation process. And this is a project in its second year, and therefore in its third year now, going into its third year. So we are here for the long run. So we will be doing this project over at least a decade, if not 15 years, because we want to see conservation outcomes, right? And the big part about this is to protect the riparian buffer, to protect the quality of the water with some do's and don'ts, and get the planters on our side. And you know, I keep telling you I'm an optimist, and when I look at the landscape of Coorg, it's actually an example of that. So 25 years ago, when I first traveled to Coorg more as a tourist, and I'm sure many of you have done so, people in Kodagu were largely known for their hunting, right? So in the night, it was very common for them to put flashlights on and go out there and shoot wild boar and so on and so forth, right? In one generation, a generation being somewhere around 20, 25 years, it has quite significantly changed. The younger generation doesn't want to hunt. They want to go with their camera. And that is a fantastic change, right? People want to talk the language of conservation. They recognize that there is a problem and that we can take the steps that are needed to solve that problem. And I want to now connect all of this to people in this room. And I'm going to refer only to the district, which is my second home, which is Kodagu, which is that district contributes, and the Brahmagiris, if you look at it, because Brahmagiris is also the source of the Kabini River in Kerala. But if you were to take this landscape, that contributes about 70% of the water inflow into the Kaveri River. So when we talk about the Kaveri, fourth stage, fifth stage, all of that, in my view, is quite immaterial. What we need to do is to look at the source and how we can conserve water along the river and at its source. And in that, projects that deal with conservation of habitat are more crucial than anything else, right? So on that note, I'm pretty much done. Thank you so much for being very patient. But before I actually close, what I do want to tell you is, this is something that actually bugs me a bit, so I need to tell you this. I often wonder, why am I making the presentation, right? And I have actually, for example, I have two members of my team here. What they know about otters, what they know about this habitat is at least 10x of what I do, right? And the only reason I'm standing here is I think my presentation skills are slightly better, right? And that too, I think, okay? It's up there. So once again, thank you guys. This is a great team that I have here, and a couple of them are not here, but thank you so much. It's a great team. And we've got some amazing support in Coorg, support from Center for Wildlife Studies, which has backed us a great deal with the project. So thank you to every one of them. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye-bye.
I guess the question I have is, we've seen your journey and what's happening with otters, the recovery, as well as the work that you've started in Coorg now. For folks sitting in this, for those that are not already engaged in conservation, is what can regular citizens do, right, to be able to support what you're doing with otters or the habitat?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Praneet. The answer I'm going to give you might sound a little surprising and probably at some right angles to what we would consider to be otter conservation itself. The single biggest challenge species in streams and rivers face is what's happening to the water. And I'm not just referring to something that's very visual and something that you would see. For example, the pollution in the water, the kind of waste that goes in and so on and so forth. That's at one level. And there's very little that each of us individually can do to stop that. But I'm a huge fan of chemical-free food for the simple reason that I've actually seen what it does to streams and to rivers, streams in particular. If you work in the Western Ghats, Praneet, and just to everyone here, you actually see that where, I'll take just as an example, if you take the Wayanad landscape, which is where we worked along a river called the Kalindi, which is just at the foothills of the Brahmagiris, a large part of that landscape is banana cultivation and Nendra banana cultivation. And that's chemically very intensive. huge amount of pesticides go in, weedicides go in. Right? And when we do our surveys, and you ask people, when you work on crabs, for example, it's very hard to really survey crabs. So you typically talk to people who harvest crabs for their protein, right? It's fascinating to see what they tell you. So places where there has been a high amount of chemical inputs in agriculture, crabs are virtually non-existent. I'll give you, can I just take a minute to tell you a story? So if you look at paddy, paddy is typically harvested in the monsoons, as all of you know, and in another month and a half, around end November or so, they will begin the harvest, and the harvest will go on for 15, 20 days, right? And most farmers who grow hybrid varieties actually use a fair bit of chemicals. Now, one of the challenges paddy growers have is that crabs make holes in paddy fields, and there are thousands of crabs that used to do that. So what they actually do is they drill little holes very close to the roots of the paddy, and therefore they damage the paddy. And a farmer typically would get something like a 20 to 25% shortfall compared to if there was no crabs, right? So there is a sort of output loss. And a chemical got introduced in the market sometime about 15 years ago called Thimet, Thimet. And that's a red category pesticide, which means it's dangerous poison. So what farmers would do is take modules of Thimet and put it down in those holes. They would actually do that. And within the morning, you would see vast amounts of, dead crabs all over the place, right? And it seemed like this is what it is. Let's look at what happened. Within 2 to 3 seasons, jackals disappeared from that landscape, right? And how do you know that? Because jackals are best known for their howling in the night. And it was common across the Wayanad landscape to hear jackals at night. Within 2 to 3 years of Thimet being used, jackals just started vanishing. Today, in Coorg, planters tell me, can we reintroduce jackals because we miss them, right? It happened in Coorg as well. So what I want to tell you is this: nobody wanted to go after the jackals. They were going after the crabs. But crabs are the prey of jackals, just as they are the prey of small-clawed otters as well, right? And jackals completely disappeared. In fact, today, you'll be really hard-pressed to meet planters who have recent memories of hearing jackals howl in the middle of the night. I just want to tell you that when we mess around with something, we really don't understand what we are getting into. And therefore, if we, as citizens living in a city or wherever we live, if we focus on chemical-free food in our diets, that's the simplest thing we can do to protect small-clawed otters, jackals, smooth-coated otters, a whole range of wildlife that we might even not be aware of, right? And it's people like us who can drive that change. I know I've sort of taken a sort of roundabout to answer your question, but there we are. Yeah.
So, having had this thought about and debate about organic food, and my father-in-law being a farmer himself, my perception is that if all of us were to move to organic food, the yield for organic food is actually about 30 or 40% in my understanding of food that is grown with fertilizers. So if all of us move to organic food, the counter could be that we'll need more land to cultivate the same amount of food, and that is also going to lead to destruction. So I'm not able to put these two pieces of information together.
Yeah. So, I don't want to spend too much time on this because otherwise we get sort of diverted from the whole issue of otters and guardians of the river and so on. What I'm saying is that's something that we can do. It's in our hands to move to chemical-free farming or chemical-free food consumption, right? Again, I don't use the word organic because many times, people have preconceived notions about what organic is, and it's expensive, it's this, it's that, etc. I won't go there. I just want to say that that's the simplest thing we can do, number one. Number two, just as what you were saying is one part of the story, there are numerous stories of people having massive successes, moving away from chemicals, but doing it in a staggered way, right? Doing it in a smooth. I'll give you an example. We work with 2 plantations in Coorg, one of which is a cardamom plantation. And cardamom is very intensive in chemical. If some of you may have read in the papers that India's exports of cardamom were banned because of chemical contamination in the trace elements of pesticides, for example. Now, this particular estate we work with, they have otters. They have a fantastic population of small clawed otters in their estate, and they are completely organic. They are making very good money. Their output is down by not 40% or not 60% or something. It's much lesser than that. Their output is down, but they get a compensation in a slightly improved price. More importantly, their input costs are down, and they're not poisoning themselves because they drink that water. Right? I think I want to emphasize that we are doing this for a much larger cause for ourselves. But having said that, I don't want to go too much deeper into this whole issue. Because he asked me what is it that we could do in cities, I believe that this is a very important thing that we could do. Right? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gopa. Let me throw it out open to folks in the audience. Anyone have any other questions? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I wish we had more time to continue the...
You don't want me talking too much.
There is some experience in North America. My daughter is in its wildlife conservation, where native wisdom of the Native Americans is being harnessed or revived to educate the city dwellers in the cooperation of, like what you were talking about, to help us become better in helping the conservation efforts. Is there some native wisdom in Coorg? I do know in Ooty they're doing that with their tribals and everything. Yes. In your region, are there any tribals and everything that we can tap into? And
may I know your name? Sorry.
My name is Praful Misra.
Okay, I call you Praful. Is that okay?
Praful is good.
Yeah. So that's a great question, Praful. And what I'm going to tell you is sort of mix of the good and the bad. So the answer is yes. There is. So if you look at Kodagu, right, which is where my team and I work, you have tribals who are actually the original inhabitants of the landscape, and there are Jain Kurubas, for example, and 2-3 tribes are there. Okay, now they are. If you were to go with them, and if you were to look at biodiversity with them, they are nothing short of amazing. They are at a different level. I mean, as a team, we would take, so we have a person who belongs to a tribe called the Malay Kudia tribe, right? And his name is Dinesh. His knowledge of the biodiversity and even of species behavior is something at a different level, right? It's really hard to get there even after weeks and years of effort on the field, right? So, for example, they would dig up a root and say, we use this root to catch crabs. How do you figure that out? I mean, it just blows your mind at some level. So the answer is a big thumbs up to that. Now, what's the not so good news? Some of the tribes that are native inhabitants of Kodagu, over the years are almost, I mean, I'm talking about the adults, the level of alcoholism is close to 80, 90%. And what we have noticed is that the communities we would like to work with, nobody lives beyond mid-40s, right? It's actually difficult to find people today in Kodagu who have the knowledge repository that would enable us to make a documentation of the fish species we find in the paddies, for example, because they're all gone. So that's the negative side of the story. So we try and look for example, Dinesh, who is part of our team, he's just an absolutely amazing guy. And the good news is that he lives an extremely healthy lifestyle. So it's very good to work with him. What you learn is the connections between, for example, otters and different species in the landscape, right? So he would, for example, the other day we were looking at a video where he talked about a tree and how the tree is really good for honeybees of a different species, not Apis dorsata. And fascinatingly, the name of the tree has the name of a crab species in it, because he says the bark of the tree smells like that crab, right? I just found it was amazing. You know, English is such a complicated language if you think about it, right? But we have such simple ways of really understanding things with native wisdom. So I think that's a great question. Thank you. I'm not sure I answered it fully though. So there's a plus and yeah.
There's another question there, Gopa.
I have a quick question about sand mining. So it seems like it's a very prominent issue in northern parts of the country. Have you until now encountered sand mining in otter habitats that you're working in? And do you see, if not, do you see this coming? And if it comes, what's the strategy?
So if you want a really detailed answer to that, be prepared to be here till 9 p.m. Sorry, yeah, the answer is, it is in 2012, when we start 2013, my team, at that time I had a team of 2 very interesting colleagues. They got onto a raft, and we didn't know what was happening to otters in the Kaveri. So we got in at near Bhagamandla, which is where the river Kaveri originates, a few kilometers downstream. And we came down in the raft over a period of many months, all the way to the border with Tamil Nadu. The sand mining was so bad that there were points at which, and I'll take a specific example, there is a temple town called Talakkad, which many of you may have visited, right? Talakkad had, the whole story of Talakkad is those temples were buried in sand. And the sand was being removed by the archaeological society because they were excavating those temples and doing some fascinating work there. By 2013 or 14, there was a short supply of sand in Talakkad because it had been completely excavated, right? Again, I don't want to stop at bad news because there is good news that follows. Some very rigorous monitoring that began from 2015 onwards means that today, when you go on that bridge and you go over the Kaveri River, about 50 to 60% of the sand has restored now. So that's the good news. Karnataka has done a terrific job in comparison, for example, to Tamil Nadu. In Tamil Nadu, sand mining is still a serious issue. Kerala is where the sand was fully mined out. They were the first state to actually really damage the ecology, and I'm not blaming the state, but I mean the miners. Now, the question is, again, not to divert too much, but how does that impact otters would be something that's important to know. So otters themselves wouldn't, as animals, they wouldn't be impacted by sand mining. But certainly their prey is seriously impacted. So many species of fish, as Sandeep will tell you, they lay their eggs in sand. Some of them spawn in water, some of them lay their eggs in sand. So if you remove sand, you're going to reduce your fish diversity significantly, very, very significantly. To what extent, we have no idea, right? So, Sandeep, do you have anything to add to what I said?
I think it's pretty spot on, especially if you take flagship species like the mahseer. They will only lay eggs on the sandy, gravelly banks of rivers. And if that gets eroded or removed, you will see the mahseer population plummet. Like you see during drought seasons, it goes down by 60–70%. And if the largest fish plummets, then obviously the otters get affected, the crocs get affected, the crocodiles. I mean, it's a cascading effect down the thing. Yeah.
Did we answer your question? Thank you. There was one question.
There's a question here.
Yes, Tanvi had a question.
Thank you so much for the really interesting talk. I have a question kind of following from the previous one. It's about springs in the Western Ghats. And you mentioned that 60% of the Kaveri's river, the Kaveri's water comes from this landscape. So I'm guessing that it's largely fed by springs. And from what I hear, springs in the Western Ghats are dying because of groundwater pumping and things. So what is the relation between that and otters that you've seen? Is there one?
I think it's such an interesting question. So there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we don't know, right? And I would classify this in the second category, right? So springs and shola forests, many of you may have trekked through them or seen the beautiful shola grasslands of the Brahmagiris and many parts of the Western Ghats, the Palakkad ecosystem in Nelliyambadis and all that. So we don't really know how they impacted. What we know, so there is another wonderful researcher called Atira. She studied small clawed otters right up. You know how streams work, just to tell everyone for a minute, is when a stream originates in, or at its origination, it's called a first order stream. And two first order streams combine to become a second order, two second orders combine to become a third order, etc. Finally, it becomes a river. So that's how it works. So otters are found all the way up to first order streams, right? So we would imagine that if some of them dries up, there is likely to be a movement of otters down, which certainly happens in the summer. So we are right now at the fag end of the Western Ghat monsoon, and around February, March is when the water begins to dry up, and around April, before the first showers, it kind of gets really dry. So then otters will definitely tend to move, and they would tend to move along with where the prey is. So in that sense, I'm able to answer you, but otherwise it's a very tough question to answer. So great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. So my history is I'm basically from Kerala, and I live on the banks of the Pamba.
Oh, yeah.
And closer towards the sea. I've grown up seeing otters there, and the fishermen there look where the otters fish and then go and fish there. So I think that's sorted out. But growing up, there was a delicacy which was frog legs. And that particular area I am from is known for it. But in the last 30 years, it's disappeared. I'm just trying to understand, have you found any correlation with frogs and otters? Because the kind of fish has really changed because of, paddy cultivation, sand mining, all of that kind of stuff.
So, Yashas, do you have an answer to that? Because I don't see a correlation between fish and otters, but the issues you're talking about are bang on, right? Absolutely. Do you have something to add or nothing? So, frogs actually have, there's a large diversity of frogs. In fact, some of you know Guru, who's like a guru on frogs, right? He's Guru Raj. He's incredible, and he's done some fantastic work. So there are tree frogs as well. So there are frogs across systems. Otters are a lot more into an ecological niche. Frogs occupy a much more ecological space in that sense. So frog legs were banned thanks to the amazing efforts of Mr. Humayun Abud Ali, who's the nephew of Dr. Salim Ali, because at some point they were actually being exported out of India. I'm talking about the 1970s. And this was one of the first affirmative actions taken by the Indian government to protect wildlife, which is why it is pretty much a landmark event in conservation, right? So it was banned because it was mass, and it was also very brutal, and they were being exported for food, and all because at that time we needed foreign exchange, inverted commas. So today that doesn't happen, other than maybe some harvesting in the northeast, etc., which is very what we would call artisanal harvesting. It's not large scale in that sense, right? But what's happening to frogs is a different story altogether, right? I don't know, Praneet, you want to add something to that?
No, I think you covered it. The main thing is because they're amphibians, they would be, especially amphibians is where you would see the first effects of climate change or habitat destruction or anything of that sort. They would be most susceptible. Any report that you read, you'll see that one of the first species to go are amphibians. So that would be an effect. Yeah,
absolutely.
Question there. Yeah.
So we all know that the construction of reservoirs do affect the otter populations. But in Kaveri River, both KRS and Kabini reservoirs exist since, say, probably more than 50 years. So there are otters in Coorg, as well as downstream in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. So has the construction of these two reservoirs affected the otter populations?
What I will do is, I'll answer that question in sort of two parts. So, it's like this. When we build dams and dams across rivers and streams, right? Particularly rivers, fish populations get impacted heavily because many species of fish actually swim up the rivers. In fact, the koile mean that I talked about is what it does is it comes down from the hills around the early part of the monsoon, and then it lays its eggs in the paddy fields or the wetlands down there. And then towards the fag end of around November, December, when there's still a fair flow of water, it actually goes back, right? But that's a low time. But many species of fish actually traverse rivers, and that gets affected. So to that extent, fish populations get decimated when dams are built. Absolutely decimated. Many of you would probably be more familiar with salmon runs in the US because they've actually blown up dams to allow the salmon runs to happen. As far as otters are concerned, they are a lot more adaptable, as I mentioned in the presentation. So what happens is when you give them a reservoir, imagine the reservoir to be a giant swimming pool, just for a moment, which it is, really. And you've got plenty of fish there. Why do you have plenty of fish there? Because the fisheries department is actually dumping fish in there so that fishermen can survive, right? What you're doing is telling the otter, can I invite you to a buffet? Right? And you're welcome to stay here as long as you wish. So what we find actually is that when you have reservoirs, they reproduce even better. And then that becomes a problem for fishermen, right? And they are also pretty adept at navigating smaller dams, not very large dams, not like the Bakra Nangal, etc., but the ones along the Kaveri. After all, the Kaveri is a very small river, if you really think about it. I mean, those of you who don't believe me, just go to the Brahmaputra. It's never ending, right? But if you look at the Kaveri River, those dams are fairly small. So they're reasonably adept at traversing the weirs or the dams of this. So they are more or less okay because the fisheries department in some way is supporting them. So full marks to the fisheries department, but only for now, right? I'm okay. How long they would do it, one remains to be seen. Yes.
The questions?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the lovely talk. My question is more from a research perspective because we're just about to set up a project on otters. Interestingly, in the Bannerghatta National Park, which we recently discovered that there seems to be a small population of about eight individuals.
Are you part of Arocha?
Yes, I'm Avinash.
Oh, okay, nice. We have spoken, but we never met.
Yes, yeah. So I'm just curious to know, because someone said about reservoirs, because this population that we're trying to look at essentially is distributed between two reservoirs, which is just about say 500 meters from each other. And what I understand from otters through literature and through your talk is that you have established populations of otters along the riparian sites, along the river courses and streams. But the landscape that I come from, we don't have a perennial source of water. It's completely rain-fed. And the closest otter population is about 60 kilometers downstream in the lower riparian state. So what would you look at in terms of conservation of this population on the long term?
So let me first, before I answer that question, there are some very interesting bits that you should know. The smooth-coated otters are found in rivers, but they turn up in the most unusual places. Let me give you 2-3 examples. The TVS factory has a part of its factory that has been restored into an ecosystem. They have a lake. There's an otter there. Just one guy. Guy or girl, I don't know, but one of them hanging around. I mean, one of them that's been spotted. Right? How did it get there? No idea. If you go down Kanakpura Road, there's the Rorish estate. And some years ago, there was a single otter that was spotted in a lake behind the Rorish estate. How did it get there? No clue. IISc, the Indian Institute of Science campus, reported one, some people reported two. Now, people often call me and ask me that, and I try to appear intelligent, but I really have no idea. I have no clue how they got there, right? So that's the first part of it. So they need connectivity. So what often happens, which we know for sure, is that during the rainy season, where you have a tank or a lake, even if it's a few kilometers away from the river, they will move away because the current in the river is very high, very strong. And they find it difficult to navigate really serious currents. So they will move into channels and feeder channels and tributaries and so on. Therefore, they would move up. It's possible that they've got marooned in some of these cases. That's one possibility, unless, of course, there's another problem that happens. Sometimes, very rarely, somebody finds a pup, an otter pup. They think it's super cute, which it is, but it can also bite pretty seriously. And then they put it up for sale by the side of the road. I'm talking about a real incident or incidents that have happened. Somebody is driving along, says there's something very cute available for sale for 200 rupees. You buy it. You bring it home and then you see this thing really bites, right? And when I tell it to sit, it doesn't listen, right? That's the problem. So then what do you do? Then you look up online and figure out it's an otter, right? And then you figure out, where do I release it? There are cases like this. I won't go into detail, not too many, but a few of them, right? Let's leave that out because that's more the exception than the rule. How do we deal with an isolated population like this? They will take care of themselves reasonably well, Avinash. I think we don't need to worry about that other than the conflict with fishermen. So if there are fishermen and there is conflict, all we need to ensure is that there is no retaliatory killing, retaliatory snaring. And that's actually, Arocha is doing quite an amazing job in the Banargata landscape, and I am really a big admirer of what they do. So that is really the key thing to watch out for. Right? Otherwise, they are very adaptable. Incidentally, smooth-coated otters are also known, though their primary prey is fish, they are also known to catch fledglings, birds, right? Because if it's a question of survival, that's what they do. Many of you, if you've driven to Pondicherry, you go past the little town of Tiruvannamalai, and there's a pond, there's a lake over there at the base of the Arunachalam hill. There's a solitary otter there, and somebody sent me a photo of that chomping on a bird, which it had picked up, right? So they are survivors in that sense, yeah. Did I answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Other questions? Yeah, this question.
Sorry, how long do otters live?
In captivity, which is actually the only data that we would have, smooth-coated otters would survive up to 10 to 12 years. You could, in some sense, parallel them to dogs, right? They would survive 10 to 12 years. In the wild, it's always likely to be lesser, right? So we would guess they would survive between, say, 6, 8, 9 years at the best. That's assuming anthropogenic threats don't actually pick them out, like, organized hunting, snaring, that sort of thing. Yeah. Small-clawed otters are probably a couple of years less because there's only 2-3 studies on small-clawed otters, Singapore Zoo, that sort of thing. So we're not very sure of the data.
Actually, that was my main question because you didn't answer that thing on how are you studying the small claw.
Oh, yeah, I didn't answer that. Okay, thank you. I'll just take a minute, Aarti, before. So my team and I, and that's Yashas and Arun, Yashas, both of them. So we 3 of us are in the ecosystem. What we actually do is we walk up the streams, and because we can't spot this, and its paw prints are massively unreliable, you can't have any survey. What we do is really look at their sprint, which is otter language for, well, poop, right? Now, some of you are likely to say, Gopa, get yourself a life, right? But I just want to tell you, it's the most beautiful, absolutely stunningly beautiful ecosystem that you could possibly, not the poop, the ecosystem, right? And this is something, people pay to go and do, and we get to do it for a living. So what more can be better, right? You get to actually walk up these streams, which are generally, once the water level has come down and there are boulders. So there's a lot of, what we look at is the density of the sprint. And obviously, where the density is high, those are the areas that they're using much more than other areas. And those are what we earmark and prioritize for conservation purposes. So that's how we study this species. Whereas smooth-coated is much more easier to study because you can actually see the individual. And then if you see the dens, very often fishermen know where the dens are. And sometime around November, December, you could even hear the pups in the dens. So you'll always know that there's an adult with the pup inside, and you can survey them. This is a lot more difficult to survey. There was a question there. Yeah. Sorry, more questions are coming this side, so tend to look this way. Apologies. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So my initial point, actually, I wanted to add to your, when you replied to what we could do, and you talked about chemical-free food. I want to also mention chemical-free soaps.
Ah, okay, nice. Yes.
Isn't soap a big polluter of water?
I would expand that category to say home chemicals, so you know what we use for cleaning and etc. etc. Yes, yes.
Cleaning agents. Yeah.
Yes.
And my second question was: can otters live outside water at all? What happens to them?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. They definitely can survive out of water. See, that's another reason why they are evolutionary order. Dolphin cannot survive outside water, right? Otters can survive for hours outside water. In fact, if you go to Mysore Zoo, I haven't gone there. I don't like zoos, so I went there once because my son was very insistent. So there are 3 otters. There were 3 otters there. There's very little water. There's hardly any water in their enclosure. In fact, it's really unfair to them. So water is the medium by which they do the following. They play, they hunt, they move. That's what they use water for. They don't, and their fur tends to dry out. So after a while, they need water to keep their fur wet. But it's not as if they can't survive if they're not in water. They can survive for quite a while, actually. And if you look at where they den, the holes of the otters, those of you who've been to the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, how many of you, other than him who works in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, how many of you have been to the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary? I'm sure quite a few of us have, yeah? So when you go there, the sort of, the tree species which is very, it's the enigmatic tree species of the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary is a species we call the Terminalia arjuna. It's a giant tree and it's a beautiful tree. And otters actually use the root systems of Terminalia to den in, right? So they often have pups there, and that's above the water level, right? So when pups are born, for example, the water can actually harm them. So they are above the water level. But I don't know if any of you have seen videos of how the female actually trains the pup to swim. Because the pups, because of the nature of their fur, even if they want to drown, they can't drown, right? They will float. But that's the way, incidentally, I would never want my mom to teach me to swim. Right? Because they are pushed out into the water and they protest like hell. And when they come back, the mom is absolutely unforgiving. She is a real dictator because she really wants the pup to swim. So it's very charming to watch those. Right? Swimming, yeah, I don't want a coach like that, right? Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Sandeep. We'll just go ahead. Why don't you go ahead?
Sandeep, you know more about otters than I do. You should be.
I actually wanted to ask, maybe Praneet can chime in as well about conflict, right? As an amusing anecdote, Deepak here actually has been in a group where someone got bitten by an otter in the water. So his first-hand knowledge. But apart from that, snaring, we have photographs of snare marks on otters even fairly recently. How prevalent is snaring even now? And the other question really was dynamite, because we see dynamite doing huge damage in the river, and it's rampant, right, because of the quarries. We know that the fish and the crabs and everything, you chuck a stick in the water, it kills. But apart from affecting the food chain, are otters actually getting maimed and killed in this dynamiting because you work in the local area so much? Do you hear of that?
I haven't heard so much about otters getting injured, but I've seen a lot of snares. I mean, snaring is, and I'm assuming I've seen a lot of snares for smaller mammals and birds, right? So at the periphery of a village, and there are certain villages where it's more rampant than others, and otters can easily get, like the snare that he was showing in his photograph, can easily get caught, and basically it's like a noose. It'll tighten in, and then it's very difficult to get out. So, I mean, at least on one operation, I found like 200 plus snares that were, I mean, across a few villages. But yeah, it's still rampant. Snares still happens. I haven't heard about otters though, and dynamiting still happens. Yeah.
So I just want to build on that before I take Lakshmi's question. So in 2014, we came across one incident which was near Kushalnagar, which is on the border of the town, really at the border of Coog, where one person was throwing dynamite in. And so what they do, for those of you who are unaware of how this works, these are not traditional fishermen. They are fishermen who are very opportunistic. They get dynamite from the quarries, and they often go to the river, maybe on a weekend, maybe on a day they get off, and they throw some food to get the fish in. And when they see a sizable quantity of fish coming in, they throw a stick of dynamite in. And that pretty much kills, as Sandeep rightly said, it kills everything. And then these fish float up. And because of the current, and this is not done in this kind of, it's typically done in the summer season, when the water flow is much slower, much lower. So there'll be somebody standing downstream to harvest that, maybe a few meters downstream to harvest it. Now, there's one incident we know about where, because they were throwing this food in and the fish were being attracted, the otters came behind. And these guys threw a couple of dynamites at the otters. And they killed 3 of them. Now, I don't know. I mean, I know about this from a third-party account. I didn't witness it. And so we were told by somebody saying that, 3 otters were killed. And subsequently, people took them out and then they buried them because otherwise the forest department would get after them, etc. So that's one incident I know about, 2014. I would in some way call it an outlier, because if something was happening very often, you would get to hear of it when you're in the field. You would get sense of people talking about it, but we don't really get that. So, yeah. You had a question, sorry.
Yeah, so before I ask my question, I just want to say what I enjoyed the most about this evening was your optimism. Right, because God knows we need that these days. And a lot of the conservation messaging we hear is all gloom and doom, right? It all ends with this really heavy message that it's all over, there's not much we can do kind of thing. So thank you for that. My question is, how have you planned to take this messaging to the next generation? Like, for instance, children, right? Have you considered having like community groups where, because and again, I think we all know this, that's where it starts, right? The strongest influence of carrying this forward starts when you're young. And I've seen that, we've all seen that in so many other occasions where children are told how things should be done right, and then they go back and they influence their parents. So have you considered anything in terms of messaging?
Fantastic question. I'm going to ask Praneet to start, because they're doing far more work on education than we are. And we are confined to a small landscape, few schools. So over to you.
Yeah, so I volunteer with a group called Vanodaya, and we've been focused on the Kaveri landscape now for, say, about 14 years, 13, 14 years. We are, at least for the last, say, 5 or 6 years, we've been running a program where we've been spending an entire year with a school. So we've picked schools on the periphery of the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. And earlier we used to go to all schools on the periphery. So it's a 1,000 square kilometer landscape, and we used to go to all the villages and all the schools. But that was just skimming the surface. So we decided we needed to take a strategy where we go deep, and we spend an entire year with the school, with a set of children over a period of time. So we started with about 2 schools. Now we cover 10 schools. And this is on the Karnataka side, on the side of in the sanctuary closer to Bangalore. Right, so on the northern side, if you go to Kanakpura and Satnur up to Malavalli and so on, that area. And so there's a few of our volunteers have designed an eco club program. So we actually spend every month we go spend time with the kids. There's a curriculum through the year, exposing them to wildlife around their school. And then with that, the broader sanctuary and the importance. And so we've been doing this consistently. So it's standard 8, 9, and 10. And the goal is to expand it even further and then have self-sustaining eco clubs within the schools that we support, that we always give them support. So we've given binoculars, and there's material there, and our volunteers go and use games and so on to be able to educate. And we also bring the teachers into that process. So there's definitely a focus, however small, but that is one of the focus, and specific to the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. So it's not broader than that, it's just in this landscape. Yeah.
I think, can I just make a point? And this is a really important question and a really important answer. So what happens is, when we educate urban kids, in some way you're preaching to the converted, right? When we go to rural children who experience human-wildlife conflict, children whose parents are hunting or parents are putting snares, they are really your target audience, right? And preaching again there doesn't work as much as engaging. So I think what Vanodaya does, for example, I'm sure Arocha does that, is a great part of that is the engagement process, because you're building trust, you're working with them over a long period of time. They also end up, even though they may be 10 or 11 years old, you have to accept the fact that they probably know more than you, right? Simply because of their experience, because of what they see on a day-to-day basis. So there's a certain amount of humility from our side, which is essential when we are there. What we've noticed is, when we've been working in Coog, we've noticed that children often come and tell us the most amazing things. In fact, on the other day on Instagram, I came across this amazing filmmaker whose first name I can't get. She is working with a community in West Bengal, getting the kids to move away from catapults to cameras. So it's called From Cameras to Catapults. And catapults as in mobile phones. So they used to hunt using catapults, and they are very skilled hunters at the age of 8 and 9 and 10. So how do you get those kids to move away from that to appreciate wildlife for what it is? So it's a very crucial element in that area. Yeah, over to you. You were saying something.
It was a follow-up. I'm glad you
Yeah, sure.
done so well. So Praneet, this is for you. Yeah. And this comes all the way from Seattle, from somebody who's been tracking this conversation. Before I ask this, you have to explain what is the importance of the last Wednesday of May.
That's World Otter Day.
Okay.
Thank you. I learned something.
So from your blog, the question comes from a conservationist and an educationist, Seattle Aquarium. There is a Marathi or Kannada children's book with the otter as a main character, probably what you're doing, and had a special event for kids from villages by the Kaveri River for the World Otter Day, last Wednesday of May.
Okay.
Have you kept in touch with the children and their families to see if the event had a lasting impact?
That's the event we did, actually.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
You talked about Kaveri, so
Yeah.
flinged it at
so
you.
There's an interest. Why don't you finish and then I'll come. Yeah.
Do ask the audience to check out the otter cam at Seattle Aquarium. They have a 24-hour live otter cam.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
So to your person, I'll let Gopa answer, but I lived in Spokane for many years, which is very close to Seattle. Yeah,
wow.
And I've hiked a lot in that part of the northwest of the US. It's very beautiful. And we were sharing a story where I saw a sea otter off the coast off the western coast while I was hiking over there. It's a very beautiful area, and the Seattle Aquarium is very, very beautiful. Why don't you talk about the otter, and I can come back and talk about education.
So this was actually inevitably every World Otter Day, somebody or the other remembers that we exist. So a few days before the Wednesday, I got a call from the Tamil Nadu Forest Department saying, can you do a workshop for the kids? And there's a brilliant cartoonist called Rohan Chakrabarti. Many of you know Rohan in this group. So I asked Rohan to give me his sketch of the otter. Please check out his work. He's just absolutely amazing. So Rohan sent it to me, and then I printed it out, and then I took it and worked, and we did a workshop for the kids. So this wasn't actually an engagement of our group. It was more through the forest department, because they remembered that we exist on that day. Will something happen subsequently? Sadly not. I wish it could be much more. Having said that, we have to applaud the intent, because what the Tamil Nadu government has done is really interesting. In every district, they have picked up 2 species that they would like to highlight as, let's say, the more charismatic species of that district. And for Krishnagiri district, which is the district adjoining Bangalore, they have picked up the smooth-coated otter because it's found in the Kaveri, and I think the 4-horned antelope. Right, so they found this. So they've also therefore created one of those centers with photos and a lot of material about the otter. So let's applaud the intent for now. I mean, that's where we are. Before I move on, I just want to. He mentioned the sea otter. So many of you would have seen videos of this completely adorable. I've never seen the animal in the wild. He's seen it in the wild. It's an interesting otter because it's one of 2 species that's found in marine ecosystems. The other one is the marine otter, which is found down south of the Americas. This one swims on its back, right? So it kind of swims belly up. And it also carries its young one, the pup, on the stomach. So it's a very interesting behavior that is quite unique, evolutionary. And it just increases your faith in Charles Darwin, because there must be some reason somewhere. Let's figure that out sometime, yeah?
Just wanted to add for the importance of education, right? And you won't see the results, immediately. It's not something that you immediately see. But what's been fascinating over a decade of being engaged here is one of the things we realized very early is as folks from Bangalore, we brought this urban, communication, and we really needed local people to be involved in conservation. And we started a session to bring more local people in, and now it's a very strong local group that's engaged in conservation work. So many of the folks who grew up in that area are now doing the education in the schools that they grew up in. And a lot of the interesting thing is their kids are now starting to get involved, who were in the schools, and it's quite fascinating, very inspiring, because as I met them, some of them are, I want to join the forest department, I want to, get involved in conservation, so it's an interesting thing to see over time. I couldn't have imagined way back when we started that we'd start to see this kind of change over time, right? And it's great to have the local folks engaged. It's very, very powerful, because how they speak, how they communicate, their knowledge of the area, what's happening, even their connection with the forest department on the ground, with the watchers who are actually at the checkposts and so on. It's locals that are talking to each other and that can support each other. So that's been very transformational to see. So education has a huge role, huge role.
Quite a lot of questions, yeah, lovely.
Hi, I have two questions actually. The first one is like, mostly the forests are in patches. So it's all like most the habitats are segmented, even the riparian vegetation. So have you observed any behavior changes or adaptations of otters towards that kind of a edge effect? So that's my first question. And second question is, you already mentioned that otters have a wide illegal market for their skin. But have you come across any incident like people or the locals eat otters? Or it has there is a misconception like the otter's flesh has a medicinal effects or anything like that?
Yeah, and thank you for two very good questions. So in the Kerala side, the Kalindi River, for example, what we have noticed is small clawed otters, they stay, so there is an interesting split. So there is a point at which the reserve forest, the stream comes through the reserve forest, and then it comes out and into an agricultural area. And then it flows for about 10 kilometers till it enters what is the Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary. So this 10-kilometer stretch is human dominated. There's agriculture on both sides, people using the stream, they wash their clothes there. So people move up and down. Because the small clawed otter is nocturnal, we see that what it does is it comes out at night there and then probably hunts around for crabs and then goes back. So you don't see sprain density there that is very high, but you see fairly regular signs of otters having been there, right? So we put 2 and 2 together, and hopefully we are getting 4. What we are saying is they're exiting this patch of forest where they are fairly well protected. They're coming out into a human area, a human-dominated stretch. They're fishing or hunting there, picking up their crab, and then they're going back in before, let's say, people start using the stretch, number one. Otter meat, that's a little more tricky too. So across India, by and large, and quite thankfully, this is one of the species that nobody has got a sort of, it's good for health, it'll get you more kids, all that stuff, right? Hopefully, nobody has put a tag on it yet. In the Northeast, there are regular reports of people hunting for the table, right? And it's, well, quite honestly, in parts of the Northeast, it's not limited to otters. It's limited to anything that would move, right? And very often even things that would not move, but we will leave that aside. So the otter is hunted. They are hunted, both species are hunted, smooth-coated otters and small-clawed otters. And I've even spoken to a person who's eaten otter meat, but we didn't have a great conversation. We are not on the same page, as you can see. So yes, so to that extent, there is some amount, but rest of India, I haven't come across too many. I don't know if you've come across anything. You haven't, right? No. Sandeep, anything you've come? Yeah. So thank God for small mercies, right? Yeah. So that's part of it. Yeah. There is also a lot of conflict with aquaculture farms, incidentally. So you have aquaculture farms along, for example, where the Krishna enters the Bay of Bengal, there are a lot of aquaculture farms. So there's a lot of conflict because once again, you're giving otters a buffet. So they go in there and pick up the prawns and then there is conflict. So that kind of stuff happens, right?
So question there, yeah. So thank you for the deep dive into the otter family in our Western Ghats. So my introduction to otters, I just wanted to clarify with you whether this was on the same thing or not. I think in the Wild Karnataka documentary, I had seen one in Kabini Basin, I guess, where they were driving the tiger out of the river belt. Was it the same?
Smooth coated.
Smooth coated.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those of you who, that's a lovely, lovely little clip, and it was taken by, well, it was either Kalyan or the other person. Whose name? Sorry?
Amog
Varsh, one of the two who would have taken that shot. So for those of you who are not very familiar with, it's a beautiful documentary called Wild Karnataka, and in that there is a particular clip where there's a tiger that's chilling out and really enjoying itself along the banks of the Kabini reservoir, and along come three otters who are not really liking it very much that they have this other guy in their midst, and they generally tend to be quite territorial that way. They are known to push crocs out, right? Those of you who see YouTube videos, you will see how they've actually killed caimans. They've pulled the giant otter in the Amazon. They've killed caimans. They've pulled jaguars into the water and finished them. So they're very aggressive, right? So they start hissing, and they have a chirp come hiss. And they start sort of standing up in a very classic periscope mode, right? Which is basically telling you, I'm just warning you, and it's time you vanished. Right? And the tiger gets the message. It gets out of the water, but the look on the tiger's face is fascinating. Right? It's a look of somebody whose ego has been badly bruised. So it's lovely to see that clip. What's Wild Karnataka, if nothing else, for just this little clip? Absolutely.
Clip, So on this, I had two small questions. One is there any relation to beaver? Small dams along the streams?
They don't build dams, but they're part of the same family, which is called mustelids. Right? So there are 4 or 5 species, and if you Google up for mustelids, mustelids, you will get a list of all the families. In fact, a classic trait of mustelids is they have a kind of hump on the back, right? So that's what we have.
Is the forest department taking any measures towards conservation?
So, okay, are we going too much beyond our time? Because
you have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So you'll be happy to know, once again, optimism. Yeah, you'll be happy to know that Karnataka has got India's first otter conservation reserve, which is actually going through the beautiful town of Hampi. It's the Tungabhadra Otter Conservation Reserve. And if we have a lot of stars aligned on our side, we might get a second one sometime in the next 100 years, right? Hopefully. So let's be hopeful. But in different parts of it, so there are 2-3 things that have happened, right? Let me go back. If you look at the evolution of the tiger as something in the social imagination, in our imagination, prior to the Wildlife Protection Act, people hunted tigers as vermin, right? You shot them because, not you, but people shot them because they were, how could a tiger be there? I mean, it's a nuisance, so you would shoot. Today, a tiger that is known to be a man-eater, if it is captured, there is a protest, right? Which is the other extreme. So I'm not going to go there. What I want to tell you is there has been a 180-degree shift in the way this animal is perceived. Pretty much the same for elephants to a significant extent, right? And now with that one very, very sort of charismatic leopard in Kabini, it's true for leopards as well, right? What I'm saying is that media and the way we look at a species and the way it captures our imagination is also playing a role in conservation. So the smooth-coated otter is something you would see 100 videos of, and people share videos and everybody is captivated. When that happens, the chance that the forest department has to take action and you get support for that action actually increases, right? Interestingly, most of that support comes from the urban crowd, right? That's okay, right? Let's not complain, because at least it's support. So what we are saying is, in some sense, the tide is changing for the better. And that, in many ways, makes the department act where otherwise they would not. The Karnataka Forest Department is miles above, and I mean miles above, the forest department in other parts of this country, some other parts of this country, right? And we have to have a real, and I'm saying this with complete honesty, that a lot of measures that they have taken have been really remarkable for conservation, yeah. So,
conversations like this bring more attention. Yeah.
Hopefully, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
The larger?
Guardians of the river.
Which are the other guardians of the river? Well, so if you were to look at how I could protect an ecosystem, you take the Gangetic dolphin, for example, or the Brahmaputra dolphin, right? It's how we look at what is necessary for protection. So if there is a species, so I'm answering it in a very general way, saying that if I have to connect that species to the habitat, and say the only way I can protect this is by protecting the habitat, by definition, you establish certain guardrails, do's and don'ts, and more particularly the don'ts, and then that animal transitions to becoming the guardian of the river or the guardian of that ecosystem. So it's a very generic thing. And Sandeep here will also tell you that as much as the otter, the mahseer, which is a huge fish and a very charismatic fish, which is now the species that he works on, is teetering on the verge of extinction, is as much a guardian of the river as the otter is. In fact, anglers like him, they call it the tiger of the river because it gives anglers a run for their money. So by protecting the mahseer, you would do exactly the same, which is why, we are exactly on the same page when it comes to protection, right? So there we are. Yeah. And Deepak, I forgot, he's the other guy along with Sandeep, the two criminals of Wildlife Association of South India. Sorry.
You could even call elephants guardians of the river.
Yes, you could call elephants as well. Yes, yes.
Any other questions? Yeah, we'll take this last question, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So you just mentioned that sometimes they migrate due to flooding or like other reasons, but in general, do they migrate otherwise, like as part of their natural?
So they're very territorial and they have territories that they patrol. I'm talking about smooth-coated otters and small-clawed as well. We don't know too much about small-clawed yet, but smooth-coated certainly. The male can be, and there was one experiment where there was a chip put in a male by Wildlife Institute of India. So they can traverse as much as 7 to 10 to 12 kilometers, which is along the stream, along the river. A pack or a romp would be much more restricted in range. So they would patrol their territory and they would be territorial. But moving out of that ecosystem would be, moving away from the river to a channel or a tributary, etc., would be very situation dependent. So where there's extremely heavy sand mining, they would move out, and if that's the way they would need to, they would do so, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. All right, thank you. Thanks, Gopa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's been a great insight into the otter here, as well as all the complexities around, and of course the optimism that you bring, right, which I think all of us have to walk away with to go back and get engaged in our own ways in conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.